The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
Liberty. Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner, cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
He was ground zero in the Trump-Russia collusion delusion. And today, George Papadopoulos joins us and tells all about how he was set up as a patsy in the FBI sting operation that threatened to take down President Trump. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com, and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. George Papadopoulos will join us in a moment, and also today, Joe Biden revives the plagiarism issue that haunted his previous failed bids for the presidency, and he gets attacked for his insufficiently progressive positions on climate change and abortion by the many radical candidates to his left, plus the latest threats and promising developments regarding your individual liberty with LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza. This is what happens when you work for Donald Trump. Those were the chilling words spoken by an FBI agent to George Papadopoulos when he was seized at Dulles Airport outside of D.C. in July of 2017, and Mr. Papadopoulos thus became ground zero for what developed into the allegation that Donald Trump conspired with Russia to steal the 2016 presidential election, and of course, the subsequent special counsel investigation, which crippled the Trump presidency and balkanized the nation. He chronicles his bizarre journey in his new book, Deep State Target, and he joins us now. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, Mr. Papadopoulos.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to it.
I appreciate it. So let's start at the beginning of this incredible saga. You're 28 years old. It's 2015, and after you've worked for a while as a foreign policy and world energy analyst in D.C. for think tanks like the neoconservative Hudson Institute, among others, you joined the Trump campaign. Trump is highly controversial, but he's winning. And despite being warned by others, you say to yourself, what's the worst that could happen? Well, you were soon to find out. You're in Rome, where you're introduced to a man claiming to be connected to the highest levels of government across the world, the soon-to-be infamous professor from Malta, Joseph Mifsud. You say in the book that you thought you were living a dream, but you now wonder in hindsight about whether it was just the type of approach that's taught in espionage school. Describe how Mr. Mifsud approached you, how he represented himself, and the nature of your interactions.
Sure, that's a great point that you made about this professor, because he is at the epicenter of probably the greatest and most pernicious spying scandal in American history, because clearly I was the one who was witnessing these events, and it was clearly a setup. And Joseph Mifsud was introduced to me by a director at a company I used to work for in London called the London Center for International Law Practice. This was a company that was affiliated by some of the most prominent attorneys in the world and Western diplomats, et cetera, and I was working as a director there in their energy department. And I told them I'm leaving and I'm going back to Washington. I'm going to be joining the Trump campaign. And they were furious. As soon as I said that to them, their antennas started to spike. I didn't understand that this organization in London I worked for obviously had some connections to the FBI too. And a woman named Arvinder Sambe, who actually worked directly with Bob Mueller after 9/11, she told me, why don't you go to Rome and meet some important people who are going to help you on the Trump campaign? And I go to Rome, or at this university called Link Campus, which is currently under investigation by Italian authorities. And I meet Joseph Mifsud there. And Joseph Mifsud, though I didn't know who this person was, that my life was, I was doing a lot of traveling at the time and meeting many people. And, of course, I had no idea who he was, except that he told me that the company that you work for wants me to help introduce you to global leaders and the Russians. And that's how he introduced himself to me, as some sort of diplomat from Malta who was connected to the world, and that he would be helping the Trump campaign. And later we find out that he was likely working with the CIA or the British intelligence services, according to Devin Nunes.
Now, another member of the Trump foreign policy team was Carter Page, the man the FBI wound up getting a FISA warrant to surveil, and then 3 renewals of that warrant. And Carter Page warns you not to be too confident about your plan to facilitate a meeting between Trump and Vladimir Putin, which Joseph Mifsud had promised to make happen. In the book, you openly wonder whether Carter Page might actually have been a Russian agent. How come?
I was very confused about Carter Page, actually. I didn't understand what he was doing, if he was potentially cooperating whatsoever with the Russians, or we later found out that he actually had a long history with the FBI, which actually, looking back, and that chapter in my book where I had that bizarre phone call with Carter Page, where he was basically threatening me and telling me he's keeping tabs on me to some extent, it was a little, it left a bad taste in my mouth, and I never quite understood why he stepped out of his lane the way he did before he even met me in person, but he did. And his background suggests that he did have contacts with the CIA, with the FBI, and I don't know. I'm not going to, spread false allegations about anyone without evidence, but clearly I think his role in all of this never really made sense to me, at least.
Okay, now you meet with Joseph Mifsud on April 26th of 2016, and he tells you the Russians have dirt on Hillary Clinton, thousands of emails. What do you do with that information?
Sure. So, as you stated at the beginning of our conversation, I was working in D.C. in foreign policy and in the energy circles, and you hear a lot of gossip when you're in these type of circles. Just like you probably do in many industries, especially if you're in an office setting, whether it's somebody's age, or their livelihood, or in this case, it happened to be the topic at the time was Hillary's hacked emails, which was obviously being openly speculated throughout the world that her State Department server had been hacked by the Russians. So about a month into meeting Joseph Mifsud, who was saying that he could introduce Trump to Putin. And look, as a foreign policy advisor, part of my duties were to introduce Donald Trump to foreign leaders. I knew Donald Trump wanted to work to some extent with Russia at the geopolitical level. That's why I thought a meeting with Putin during the campaign would be a good idea. That didn't work out, of course, because the campaign didn't want it. So then I ended up introducing Donald Trump to the Egyptian president in September of 2016 at the UN General Assembly. So that was part of my duty. So people just who are listening can understand that there was nothing illegal or nefarious or illicit going on about a campaign attempting to set up a foreign policy trip for the candidate that they were working for. Barack Obama went abroad. Mitt Romney went abroad. Candidates usually do this to highlight that they can work with global leaders and obviously to impress the electorate back home. So that was really the logic behind that attempt.
There's lots more to come with George Papadopoulos. He'll talk about the next steps in this setup with more mysterious figures. That's when it really gets interesting. A bit later in the show, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. But first, after a quick break, our signature segment, Say What?
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Exhausted by all the fake news? On LibertyNation.com's YouTube channel, facts and fresh, bold analysis are what you get without the leftist spin. Subscribe today to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel because
Truth
is making a
comeback.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
Say What, where we roll out an assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. The mud will soon hit the fan for Democrats, growing increasingly fretful about the upcoming revelations on the origins of the Obama administration spying on the Trump campaign, using a disinformation dossier from Trump's political enemies to secure a FISA warrant to justify the surveillance, and then spreading preposterous allegations that led to a 2-year investigation. The Justice Department will soon release the findings from the Inspector General's internal probe and then from Attorney General William Barr's own investigation into the matter. And in a revealing interview on CBS that ought to leave Democrats in something of a state of panic, Barr repeated his belief that the Trump campaign was spied on and that he's dealing with a lot of troubling questions.
I think there's nothing wrong with spying. The question is always whether it's authorized by law. I had a lot of questions about what was going on, and I assumed I'd get answers when I went in, and I have not gotten answers that are at all satisfactory, and in fact have probably more questions, and that some of the facts that I've learned don't hang together with the official explanations of what happened. Sometimes people can convince themselves that what they're doing is in the higher interest, the better good. They don't realize that what they're doing is really antithetical to the democratic system we have.
Ominous words. And Democrats know that the cold, hard facts of how, when, and why the Obama Justice Department spied on the Trump campaign will soon be made public, and they have reason to be afraid. Very afraid. Now, you would think that Joe Biden would have learned by now that if there are two things he simply could not do as a presidential candidate, they are continuing to put his hands on those of the opposite sex and presenting other people's ideas as his own. But old Uncle Joe has now revived both those issues in recent days. First, putting his arm around a 10-year-old girl for a picture and then making light of all those women he creeped out with his handsy conduct. And then we discover that his campaign copied and pasted the exact words of certain environmental organizations on their website without attribution, ripping open an old wound from the first of Biden's two previous and disastrous presidential campaigns. That would be 1987, when he was forced to withdraw from the presidential race after it was discovered that he plagiarized a speech by British politician Neil Kinnock almost word for word. Here it was, 32 years ago.
Why is it that Joe Biden is the first in his family ever to go to a university? Why is it that my wife, who's sitting out there in the audience, is the first in her family to ever go to college?
Why am I the first Kinnock to be able to get to university? Why is Gladys the first woman in her family? Was it because they were weak? Those people who could work 8 hours underground and then come up and play football? Weak?
My ancestors who worked in the coal mines in northeast Pennsylvania and who come up after 12 hours and play football for 4 hours?
Does anybody really think that they didn't get what we had because they didn't have the talent or the strength or the endurance or the commitment? Of course not. It was because there was no platform upon which they could stand.
No, it's not because they weren't as smart. It's not because they didn't work as hard. It's because they didn't have a platform upon which to stand.
So the P word, plagiarism, rears its ugly head again for the bumbling Democratic frontrunner in a mistake that had even Trump-hating elite media types like Chuck Todd at NBC and Jake Tapper at CNN calling Biden's campaign amateur hour.
Joe Biden has his name on a public policy institute at the University of Pennsylvania. He's been preparing to run for president at least for the last 18 months, perhaps longer than that, in different ways. Why are they cutting and pasting climate change proposals at the last minute? Is this a sloppy campaign? Are they not up and running? What's going on?
This was obviously a junior varsity moment for this campaign in what should be very much the varsity level squad. It's embarrassing.
This is a pretty amateur mistake for the frontrunners campaign to make on a substantial policy rollout when they had to know, when Team Biden got together planning to announce his campaign, the one thing they cannot do is plagiarize.
But if being criticized by his friends in the elite media wasn't enough, Biden's big but somewhat dwindling lead in the 24-person presidential primary race has now made him a magnet for attacks from the other 23 candidates, all to his left, who are decrying his relatively moderate positions as insufficiently radical on climate change, among other issues. Here are Bernie, Pocahontas, and Mayor Pete.
We cannot go back to the old ways. We have got to go forward with a new and progressive agenda. We have got to make it clear that when the future of the planet is at stake, there is no middle ground.
Our country is in a time of crisis. The time for small ideas is over.
The riskiest thing we could do is try too hard to play it safe.
Now, another issue the other Democratic presidential candidates will use against Biden is abortion, after Biden reaffirmed his long-standing support for the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits the use of federal funding for abortions. As Matthew Continetti of the Washington Free Beacon said on Fox News, this is yet another issue sure to tail Biden throughout this primary full of far-left candidates.
This is a Biden test because even though Democrats, of course, oppose the Hyde Amendment and taxpayer funding of abortion, the public at large actually supports Hyde Amendment. They oppose taxpayer funding for abortion. This is revealed in polls by Marist on the abortion issue every year, including this one. So here's Biden's conflict between appealing to the Democratic base, which has moved left on this question and others, and a general election candidacy where support for the Hyde Amendment would not harm him.
Indeed, that is a question Joe Biden will likely ask himself probably every day for as long as he remains atop the Democrats' presidential field. How far left will I have to go to win the nomination without setting myself up for a mighty fall in the head-to-head general election race against President Trump? Quick break, and then we're back to continue our discussion with a man who was at ground zero of the deep state plot to take down President Trump, George Papadopoulos.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Exhausted by all the fake news? On LibertyNation.com's YouTube channel, facts and fresh, bold analysis are what you get without the leftist spin. Subscribe today to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel because
truth is making a comeback.
What we have heard here today has been a political spectacle.
We elect these guys to run the country. They're just not doing their job.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We're back now to continue our discussion with George Papadopoulos. In the first segment, he discussed the mysterious Maltese professor Joseph Mifsud, who told him the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton, thousands of emails. But the plot thickened from there. Shortly after your meeting with Mifsud, where he said that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton, about 2 weeks later, on May 10th, 2016, you have a fateful meeting in London which changes your life with another man whose name is sure to be in the news in the days ahead, an Australian named Alexander Downer, who is very confrontational with you. Take it from there, if you would.
Sure. So after Joseph Mifsud told me that the Russians have thousands of Hillary Clinton emails, I never told anyone on the Donald Trump campaign. I never told Donald Trump or Steve Bannon or anyone, even though I was in daily communication at that time with Stephen Miller, Corey Lewandowski, and others when I was living in London. So I never told anyone. First of all, I wasn't there to discuss hacked emails. It's not my business. And I'm not involved in any illegal behavior, and neither is the campaign. So clearly, when I met Joseph Mifsud and he told me this information, I had no idea that that's why he was wanting to meet with me. So then, as you stated, I met an Australian diplomat very suspiciously 10 days after Joseph Mifsud told me this information. And Alexander Downer, for the listeners of the program, is one of Hillary Clinton's and Bill Clinton's best friends in the world. When he was Australia's foreign minister, he donated $25 million of hard-earned Australian taxpayer money to the Clinton Foundation. Clearly, during my encounter with him, he was very hostile to Donald Trump and his policies and expressed the views of the Australian government that they clearly preferred Hillary Clinton and viewed Donald Trump as a pariah. So this individual, who I reported eventually to the FBI, to Congress, because I thought he was recording my conversation with his phone, ended up somehow giving some information to somebody that was passed along to the corrupt FBI under Jim Comey to help launch an investigation, which apparently was part of why they launched this investigation. I don't buy that story. I don't think William Barr buys that story. During his interview on CBS recently, he openly debunked that the investigation was launched in July, and it was launched much earlier than that. And it's in my firm belief, and I've been very open about this, and the president has been supporting my contention that the Australians were clearly in on this operation against us from the beginning. Now,
the story that's been told and retold in the media was that when you met with Alexander Downer, the Australian, the pro-Hillary Clinton Australian diplomat, that you were plied with liquor, you were drunk, and that you spoke, you told tales out of school, but you deny that you had too much to drink at that infamous meeting and that you ever told Mr. Downer that the Russians had damaging material related to Hillary Clinton, right?
You're absolutely right. And, Downer himself has gone public, and I even wrote it in my book. We had one light gin and tonic, and I was so disturbed by Alexander Downer's behavior that, as I explained, that I actually reported him to both Congress and the FBI for spying on me, because he was holding his phone in a manner that I thought was recording my conversation, and I didn't understand, quite frankly, what he was doing until later on. Of course, Bob Mueller's own prosecutors told me that he was basically recording my conversation. He was obviously part of an operation, and this information has never been told before. I've just recently come out with my story, and I testified about this behind closed doors to Congress, and that testimony has just now come out. But when the president talks openly about the need for William Barr to investigate the UK and Australia, he's not simply, these are not off-the-cuff remarks. There's a reason he's suggesting it, and there's also a reason why William Barr wants to actually look into the origins of this investigation and to understand why these foreign governments were spying on us themselves.
Yes, and those investigations by the Attorney General and by the Inspector General are, of course, well underway, and we'll start getting results from those investigations soon. But that meeting with Downer was in May of 2010. Let's fast forward 4 months to September 2nd, 2016, about 2 months before the election, and you get an email from a man you describe as a morbidly obese American professor at Cambridge University in England who sweats profusely and was nicknamed the Walrus, Stephen Halper. What transpires after that message that came seemingly out of the blue in what you describe as Halper hell?
Yes, that's a great point in question. So Stefan Halper is at the center now of, besides the foreign government interference, which includes Alexander Downer and Joseph Mifsud, who were working clearly with the British and the U.S. intelligence services to spy on us. Stefan Halper actually took it one step further, and he had been trying to set up Michael Flynn as early as 2015 with this Russian woman named Svetlana Lukova, who has recently sued Stefan Halper. And Stefan Halper has a history of spying on rival campaigns and worked with the CIA. So when I got this email, I didn't know who this person was, except that he had worked for a couple U.S. Administrations, and he worked at Cambridge, and he wanted to pay me some money to write a report on the energy business in Israel, which I was an expert on at the time. So I flew to London, and I was expecting just to have a normal business meeting until he introduces me to this assistant of his who the New York Times obviously wrote about, this Azra Turk, who clearly was an agent, and I was very suspicious about her. I don't think she was working with the FBI. I think she was probably a foreign asset working with the CIA. And he basically, as I explained in my book, The Deep State Target, is there to spy on me for my political and business ties in the Middle East and to assure that I'm not advising Donald Trump on those issues, and then to record my conversations, which he was doing over the 3 days we were there. And that's what Donald Trump has declassified. That's what members of Congress now are openly discussing regarding transcripts of my meetings with informants. And we're going to get to the bottom of who actually was handling this guy and why he was trying to entrap Flynn and me.
Yes, I'm certain you're waiting with more breathless anticipation than almost anybody else at the results of these investigations by the Attorney General, on top of the Inspector General, whose report has been going on, or whose investigation has been going on for some time now. All right, so shortly after Trump shocks the world, wins the election, and takes office, the FBI interrogates you, and then months later, in July of 2017, the FBI snags you at Dulles Airport, throws you in jail, and ultimately accuses you of lying to them and facing up to 25 years in prison. Tell us how that whole thing went down.
There was a very strange man named Charles Towell, who I think was part of an entrapment operation run by the special counsel against me. In March, April, May, June, July of 2017, about a month after the FBI came to my house trying to catch me in a perjury trap, which they ended up doing. And this man came to me under the fake auspice of wanting to do business with me and some sort of consulting, and he gives me $10,000 in cash in a room in Israel without me understanding why he's giving it to me, except that I thought that this was probably some sort of operation. As you saw in my book, I take this money, I go give it to my lawyers in Greece, where I was vacationing at the time, and I tell this individual, do not contact me again. A couple days later, I fly to Dulles, where I had an interview waiting with Fox News, actually, at the time. And I'm arrested at an airport without the agents telling me what I had done wrong. They're looking through my bags, looking for this $10,000, which now there's been reports that the special counsel himself and his team actually directed at me, which is a whole new can of worms that you're going to probably see some headlines about over the next months. And I'm basically told that this is what happens when you work for Donald Trump by some very aggressive agents of the FBI after I'm in a daze and jet-lagged after coming off a 12-hour flight. So I don't know what's happening. I'm basically thrown in a cell as if I'm a narco dealer or a terrorist. They probably were treated better than I was as an American citizen. And then I'm looking at a judge the next day without being told what I had done wrong, and the judges and the prosecutors are saying, you're looking at 25 years in prison, without me understanding what I had done. So the whole situation was incredibly chaotic. This entire investigation, as I detail in my book, was clearly pre-planned, orchestrated, involved foreign governments, foreign intelligence, a weaponized U.S. intelligence, in order to assure that Donald Trump would not win the 2016 election. And if he did win, as you explained at the beginning of our conversation, his presidency would be crippled by a witch hunt, which I don't agree that his presidency was crippled. I think he did a great job. I think the economy and the U.S. has rebounded tremendously under President Trump, but still, it was an unnecessary intrusion into this country, and it did divide the country. And I think what these new investigations are about healing this country and assuring what happened in 2016 never happens again to an American citizen, a political campaign, or the president himself.
I thank you so much for sharing your story, not just with us, but with the American people. And thanks for joining us today on Liberty Nation Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
That is George Papadopoulos. His book is Deep State Target, How I Got Caught in the Crosshairs of the Plot to Bring Down President Trump. We will break away and then come back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now it is time, some would say beyond time, to welcome back into the program our constitutional lawyer and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, regular contributor to the program, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
All right, San Francisco police got a warrant to monitor a journalist's phone before raiding his apartment. What is the significance of this story?
This is the Brian Carmody writing about or releasing the details about the public defender Jeff Adachi's death. Now, Mr. Adachi was a critic of the police, as often public defenders are. You can imagine the San Francisco public defender might be especially critical of police. And some of the seedier details surrounding the circumstances of his death were revealed publicly. I don't mean this has nothing to do with the cause of death. Basically, there's an allegation he was cheating on his wife with some other lady at the time he died. And those details were leaked to Carmody. Now, they got a big black eye because those details weren't supposed to come out. So, in their zeal then to cover up their own unprofessionalism, the San Francisco police raided Brian Carmody's apartment with a sledgehammer, and they took all his electronic devices. It's been a scandalous event in San Francisco and against journalism. Well, now the new news is we know that the police had a warrant to both search his electronic devices at the time of the death of the public defender and ongoing afterwards. And this is all in violation of California's SHIELD law, which protects journalism and their products from this kind of invasion.
Well, now, warrants are something that are issued, I would think, in your opinion, we discussed it before, way too easily. The bar is way too low for issuing warrants, and that includes FISA warrants like the kind that was procured by the Obama administration to spy on Donald Trump.
Yeah, and those warrants are just always granted.
Right.
You'd think, Tim, and one of the reasons why I think this is even more newsworthy, that a San Francisco judge would have some respect for the rule of law when dealing with a journalist in the death of the public defender. Like, maybe let's get a second set of eyes on this warrant application. But Judge Rochelle East of the San Francisco County Superior Court did not do so. Now, there is another component of the story, which is that potentially Chief William Scott of the San Francisco Police Department lied to the judge and didn't say that Mr. Carmody was a journalist in the application for the warrant. So it's still a developing story, but a black eye on all of their
You mean sort of like the Justice Department not indicating that the Steele dossier was actually a disinformation dossier collected by the Donald Trump's political enemies?
Yes,
I mean,
sir.
there are analogies, you got to admit, Scott.
It's
But let's move on to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, which ruled that cursing at a traffic cop, which is something common to many, if not most Americans, does not constitute a crime. Whew, thank goodness for that, Scott.
Yeah, Fort Smith, Arkansas is not like the Northeast where we grew up, Tim, where cursing at a traffic cop is done for sport, I think. We see these cases quite often where police officers take offense at people who take offense to them and then sort of try to impose their judgment and offense against them with their arrest powers improperly. Unfortunately, there's no one, I think, Supreme Court case that controls in this instance, but each circuit has had to go through, it seems like, and knock these sorts of claims down. So I think it's very refreshing. It's not refreshing that Trooper Legarian Cross from the Arkansas State Troopers thought that it would be okay to throw somebody in a cell for 8 hours for the crime of cursing at him. And by the way, the guy, the person that he had pulled over, so this trooper had pulled somebody over for speeding, and the person yelled at them because they didn't like that enforcement tactic, and he abandoned his speeding stop to go chase this guy down and throw him in a cage for 8 hours. So, is there a crime in being unpleasant to a police officer? Is that a statute somewhere, Scott? Just the blue book that nobody gets to see, that the troopers somehow get at the academy. No, there is not, Tim. All right, Donald Trump has been perceived and for the most part, rightfully so, as a pro-Second Amendment president. However, months ago, in a story we discussed, he came out in favor of banning bump stocks after the Las Vegas massacre of many months ago. And now he says he's seriously looking at banning gun silencers, or suppressors, as they're called by people who own guns. What's this all about? Why is he on the case of silencers? Well, I raised my eyebrows when you said that he was perceived as being a good pro-Second Amendment president. I think that for the gun community, there was a giant sigh of relief that Hillary Clinton, who they were all convinced would be one of the worst presidents in American history on gun rights, as she promised to be, that Trump wasn't that. But I wonder if he's actually done anything for gun rights, besides the absence of the ante, right? Mm-hmm. And what he did on bump stocks, Tim, was scandalous, I have to say. He just, with the stroke of his pen, said that the many thousands of Americans who own these thousands of legal products were felons if they didn't destroy their product. Mm-hmm. And they had letters from the ATF in those products that said this is legal according to our interpretation of this law. And there's a threat now that he may try to do the same thing with silencers or suppressors, as you correctly note, because they don't actually make a gun silent. They just massively reduce. What people hear in part of what they hear with a gunshot is the rapid expansion of the air and the contraction of the air at the point of the muzzle blast. Well, what a silencer or suppressor does is just helps control that in a way that greatly reduces the noise. But one thing that's massively different between the suppressors and the bump stocks, and I think I'm telling you new news for you, Tim, is every suppressor that's legally owned in the United States is registered with the ATF. So to ban bump stocks, you have to go try to find out where the bump stocks are. You don't necessarily know. The federal government knows where every legally held suppressor is. It's registered with the government. Okay, thank you, Scott. Thank you. This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole. Politics and Prose with our managing editor, Mark Angelides, all available to you on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So, that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.